Watercolour butterfly, that's what this video is all about. And here are some ideas on how I put the details on those very tiny little wings. Plus also why I use watercolour black and also watercolour white paint. Hi, my name is Paul Hopkinson and I'm a wildlife artist. I teach online on how to paint wildlife in watercolour, and this is to a realistic style as well for both animals, birds and botanical work using my 40 plus years of painting experience. Now don't forget to click on subscribe down below and also click on that bell icon as well, because at least that way around, when you click on that bell icon, YouTube will let you know when I've placed a brand new video on here for you to watch. So to begin with, what I like to do is work with a size 00 brush. Now I know that's a small brush, but it's one that I've used for many years and I do like to try and get those really fine details as I do this. Now when you work on all the lines, especially something like a butterfly wing, I tend to work on not just straight lines or solid lines. I like to stipple those lines in so they're broken up as well, so it's much more natural that way around. You'll also notice as well, when I do the stippling work, I like to have those stipples further apart. Kind of gives me more of a kind of natural look to the wing as well, without it being too samey really. We've got to be careful of that when you're working on anything like this. But every layer that we add on, so every stippling layer that we add on, will gradually build up layer upon layer upon layer, creating more of a realistic kind of three-dimensional feel that's going to be on top of these wings. You will find as well, when you really pinch into a reference photograph of a butterfly, maybe this paper kite or anything like that, you find that the details on the wings are made up by these tiny dots, these tiny stipple marks. So you can see why I tend to work in this way as well. But also this creates that lovely texture that we need. I may decide to soften those little details down afterwards as well, just kind of knock them back a little bit. You'll also find as well, when I paint the edge of this particular butterfly, the wings are nice and neat. They're not broken away as some butterflies tend to get, don't they, as they get older. So these are nice and smooth, so I'm not slipping those on this time around. I like to kind of start light as well, so you always start off with the lightest colours first. And don't go too thick with your consistency of paint, because by doing that, starting with a light coloured wash, you can gradually build up your layers of depth and then gradually darken those colours as you go along. So start light and gradually get darker as you go through the process. Another thing as well you find when you do it this way around, if you're making little mistakes or happy accidents or anything like that at the early stages, they're much easier to repair or to fix at those early stages rather than trying to fix them later on within the painting. But even though these wings are black, as you can see in the reference photograph there, I'm actually using a brown to fill these in, because I can see through this colour. Black isn't black, so to speak, not like a real kind of flat black. There is colour within that black. So I'm trying to give it a bit of a warm feel, but also by working with brown first of all, and a pale version of it, as you can see, that allows me then to kind of overlay that dark colour gradually, as I've just been speaking about, just in case there's a few little mistakes along the way, and it just gives me that room to kind of adjust the details as I go along. What do you find as well when you're working on a painting like this? You got to think about trying to get that nice kind of fluid motion with your hand and the brush. So having the painting in the right direction, I can twist my hand and my wrist like I'm doing here, and by doing so that gives you a nice kind of smoother line as well. But a little tip as well, is by, when you're doing this, don't touch the paper straight away, okay, when you're trying to gauge it with the movement of your wrist. Ghost over the top, so just don't touch it. I call it ghosting, so just don't touch the paper straight off. And then when you're confident you got that shape right, then you can come down with that brush tip and apply that line. Now, one thing I say within all my videos is look carefully at that reference photograph. It's vital that you do look carefully at it. So by having, as I mentioned, a very large reference photograph, one that you can pinch into and look at all those little tiny details inside, the ones that obviously we want to paint. But by looking backward and forward at the photograph every few seconds, which is what I do, I've got mine on a tablet in front of me. That enables me then to help have that image in my mind a little bit longer, so I can go to the painting and try and get those measurements as accurate as possible, and those details obviously in the right place. When I'm working on these little sections within one of these wings, I'm going to stipple these in this time around because, again, I want to create that kind of textured feel that you've got within the wings. So by tapping and stippling, I'm making some little random marks in places as well. You find that all works to create that kind of realistic feel, just to this one little wing in question, you know, and we'll do the same on the other wing as well. I also like to take as much time as possible when I'm working on this. In fact, you should never, ever rush a painting, okay? But you find that when you're working on the stippling motions as well, it's quite a repetitive thing, but you mustn't overload that brush. Too much paint on the brush will cause far too many large blobs, if you wish. So just remember that, take a little bit of paint off on some kitchen roll first. I also like to kind of work out those details within the wings. So when you're looking at this pattern here, I'm stippling around the edge of these individual shapes first of all. Again, I don't want these to look too liney. You know what I mean? I want these outlines to be a little bit dotty as you go around the edges of these individual shapes. Because it wouldn't be perfectly kind of outlines if somebody's had a ruler and drawn them. So stipple around the edges first of all, and then start to fill that in. It's always tempting just to get a whole load of paint, just blop it all in there, but in this case I'm going to add these tiny dots one by one just to fill the section in as I go through the whole process. Now you notice as well how much darker these areas become with every additional layer of paint. So as I mentioned earlier on, is that you need to work from light to dark, but by doing so you can gradually increase those darks as well. But that's how I tend to work on this. I tend to work from light to dark, and by doing so you can actually create the form, you know, the overall shape of the wings. And this applies to whatever I paint as well, be it insects, dogs, cats, bears, and anything really, even down to birds. So I always tend to approach it in the same way. So working with these darker layers, as you can see now, starts to bring this painting together. And that's when you get this little buzz inside you where you're thinking, oh, it's working. So again, I'm going around the edges of these by stippling those lines. Taking my time, just making sure that I get them in the right place, considering those overall shapes, remember, and also the colour as well. Because remember, we've got this colour underneath the wings, but we want some of that colour to show through. So by leaving gaps in those stippled lines, and also because of that colour will gradually peek through in places. Not too much, just a little bit, but enough to kind of make it stand out. and this also eventually adds that variety of tone and also those little details and patterns within the wings. Now the way I tend to work with my brush, when I load it with paint, okay, I load it, I roll it as I'm pulling away from that mixing palette, then I lightly tap it once or twice, just very lightly, on some kitchen roll as well. That will ensure that my paintbrush isn't too overloaded. So a little tip for you to do that way around, and you find you'll be able to get those finer details that way as well. Now white paint is something that I like to use on a regular basis, and this is watercolour white. It needs to be opaque in nature. But this is that final touch that really brings this painting together. We've had our light tones, we've had our mid tones, we've had our dark tones, and now going back, all the way back around the spectrum to the very bright whites, so hence the watercolour white over the top. We can also use watercolour white to kind of brighten different areas and different sections of the painting. So you could use the watercolour white not too thick, so think about different consistencies from watery, milky, creamy and also thick. So the thinner the white, you find the more duller the paint will dry. However, I like to use a white to more of a creamy consistency, especially for this area here. So you find this really make it stand out that little bit more. But keeping it creamy just means you don't want to add too much water to the paint at all, and then literally just a very tiny amount of water is all you'll need. Otherwise you find it will fade as it dries. Always looks brighter to begin with when it's white, but will certainly fade as it dries down. And as I mentioned near the beginning, make sure you got that very large reference photograph, okay? So when you do take a photograph of your own, make sure your camera is on its largest setting possible, and that also applies to you if you're using your mobile phone as well. Have a look at the app on the mobile phone, have a look at the settings that it's got on it, just make sure it's on the highest one possible, okay? But that's how I tend to work with my photographs, because at least that way, the larger the photograph, the more detail you see when you pinch into that reference photograph, and that way you're going to replicate that detail as well within your paintings.